These Chris Mac cookies are giving me the vapors.
My belly know me, and I on the kinda know you.
But Frankie, it's Christmas. Oh, Frankie, please. That cheese sauce is for your enjoyment, Frankie. Frankie's precious little hands. I think Frankie would like a washboard. Fresh parsley, Frankie. Do you know how to fluff a tree, Frankie? What's this thing with you and peppers, Frankie? Go ahead, Frankie, dig in. This is a new kitchen tool, Frankie. Frankie? Frankie? Occasionally, Frankie. Apply more heat, Frankie. Oh, Frank. Oh, Frankie, come try this cheese. I don't know what I'm gonna do, Frankie. Now, Frankie. Frankie, look what we've got here. Holy crap, Frankie. Oh, Frank. Frankie. Frankie Frain. Frankie. Oh, Frankie. What's wrong with Frankie? Oh, Frankie. Well, I can create and destroy Frankies at will. How low can we go, Frankie? Frankie? You did good, though, Frankie. Frankie's got it. Frankie, I'm very excited. Frankie. Thank you, Frankie. Squeeze the cheese in, Frankie. Very, very spicy, Frankie. Oh, Frankie. I'm cheap, Frankie. You can do it, Frankie. Look at this, Frankie. I don't know what to do, Frankie. Frankie! A special noodle, Frankie. We're gonna get it, Frankie. Oh, Frankie. Ooh, Frankie. Oh, crap, Frankie. The Frankie's all getting restless. Fresh, Frankie. Frankie. Oh, Frankie. Frankie's noodles. Frankie. Now, Frankie. That's right, Frankie. Now, Frankie. Look at this, Frankie. All right, Frankie. Look, Frankie. Frankie, huh? Uh-oh, Frankie. That's right, Frankie. Frankie Frain. Dear Frankie. Exactly, Frankie. Now, Frankie. And Frankie. Noodles, Frankie. Not bad, Frankie. So, Frankie. She is Frankie. Frankies. Oh, Frankie. Oh, Frankie. All right, Frankies. Frankies. Frankie. All right, Frankie. The Frankie. Frankie Frain. Oh, Frankie. Well, Frankie. Frankie. Francis. Frankie. Now, Frankie. Oh, Frankie's love. Frankie Frain. All right, Frankie. Now, Frankie. Well, Frankie. Oh, Frankie. So, Frankie is Frankie. Francis. Frankie. You know Frankie. Frankie's Frankie. Oh, Frankie. Now, Frankie. All right, Frankie. Frankie's Frankie. So Frankie. Frankie, Frankie's, 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 Frankie, 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 Frankie is Frankie, 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 Frankie's Frankie, 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 Frankie's Frankie, 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 all that's Frankie, 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 I've been to stores before in my life. Frankie, I've been to stores once or twice.
Frankie, I've been to stores before in my life.
Frankie?
Sugar Bear.
Oh, Noodle.
Frankie, not Frank.
My partner today is Frankie Frain.
Hi, I'm Frankie. Hi, I'm Frankie.
The Frankies are getting restless. Calm down, Frankies, calm down.
Now Frankie.
I'm sorry, Frankie.
A guy called Frankie Frain.
My name is Frankie Frain. My name's Frankie Frain. Frankie. Frankie?
What's Frankie?
Thank you, Frankie.
Everybody named Frankie. Hello, Frankie. Frankie. Are you Frankie? Frankie, the vegan.
Frankie Frain.
Frankie. Frankie Fran.
Fresh Frankie.
Frankie Frain.
Frankie. Shut up, Frankie. Frankie Frain.
Frankie.
Hey, Frankie.
Frankie Frain.
Frankie. Hi, Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie's. Frankie.
Frankie.
So Frankie.
Frankie Frain.
Frankie. Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie's.
Frankie.
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 Frankie. Frankie Frain.
Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie. Frankie. Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie with Frankie.
Frankie. It's Frankie.
Frankie's. Frankie. Frankie's.
Frankie's.
Frankie.
Frankie's.
Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie's.
Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie. Frankie. Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie's.
Frankie.
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 Frankie. Frankie's.
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 Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie's.
Frankie.
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 Frankie. Frankie's. Frankie. Frankie's.
Frankie.
Frankie. Frankie.
Frankie.
Frankie.
Noodles.